Our next speaker is Mike North. Mike's a 25-year employee of the Minnesota DNR, where he's been involved in environmental review, wetlands protection, and wildlife habitat planning, mostly out of the Brainerd office. Prior to that, he was a 10-year employee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska in research, environmental review, and endangered species work. He has a bachelor's degree from Iowa State and a master's from North Dakota State. He's also a master bird bander and is partnering in research projects with Bemidji State, the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, Central Lakes College, the Purple Martin Working Group, the University of Manitoba, and Deep Portage Conservation Reserve. His current obnoxious obsession is woodpeckers. Mike.
Thank you, Clinton. And thank you for allowing me to come talk to you today about Aspen. You might be thinking, well, what does Aspen have to do with birds? And hopefully by the time I'm done talking, you'll appreciate the connection. Before I get into my talk, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Samantha Jones, head of the Tree Ring Lab at Bemidji State University, and Gretchen Mamel, the retired manager of the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area. So it's a simple question that I ask, but it's an important question. Sure. All right. It's a simple question that I ask, but it's an important question. A lot of our cavity-dependent wildlife are ecosystem engineers. Woodpeckers in particular create the cavities that other wildlife later on use. And some of the secondary cavity users are things like our squirrels that distribute seeds across the forest, plant them in the forest, also plant or distribute mycorrhizal fungi. And so they are responsible for a lot of the ways that our forests are structured. They're also keystone species. The European counterpart of our three-toed woodpecker, for example, can consume anywhere from 95 to 99% of the injurious insects that occur in their territory. And even things like the lowly red squirrel can consume so many seeds and cones that they can influence the winter migrations of our winter finches. Aspen is extremely important for nest sites for our woodpeckers. This is data that I've assembled for Minnesota only, and you can see that 95% of yellow-bellied sapsuckers nests occur in Aspen, and 70% of hairy woodpecker nests occur in Aspen, and then 67% of pileated woodpecker nests, although I do have a small sample size for pileateds. In British Columbia, Martin et al. Assembled nest webs where they looked at the primary excavators, in this case pretty much all woodpeckers, and then looked at the reuse of those cavities. But the important information in this slide is that of the nearly 1,200 nests that they found, 96% of them were in Aspen, and this was in British Columbia. But in that location, Aspen comprised only 15% of the trees available. So a clear selection for Aspen. I assembled a lot of data from the literature and from my own data too to identify thresholds of tree diameters that woodpeckers can use, and other wildlife too, including things like fisher and marten and bats. And there's a lot of ways to slice and dice this, but I selected three snippets from a table that I assembled, kind of the low end of the threshold spectrum, the middle, and then the larger end of the threshold spectrum. But just for example, here at 15 centimeters dBH, we have the minimum size trees that downy woodpeckers will use. Here at 25 centimeters dBH is a threshold that was identified in British Columbia where woodpeckers preferentially select trees above that size beyond their proportion on the landscape, and below that there's more trees that they're not necessarily avoiding, but they're selecting at less proportionate to what's on the landscape. We can look at this from different species, for example, downy woodpeckers versus hairy woodpecker sapsuckers. We can look at it whether we're just interested in Minnesota or other provinces and states. We can look at whether we're just interested in Aspen only or whether we're interested in mixed forests. So there's a lot of ways to slice and dice this. Whatever threshold somebody picks, somebody else is going to object to it. And so I just wanted to put the full spectrum out there that anybody could use this as a menu to pick something that they're interested in considering when they manage their land, for example. Going down to the middle series here in the 30 to 35 centimeter DBH range, we see a lot of different thresholds that have been identified for hairy woodpeckers, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, northern flickers. And when you get to the far end of the range, for example, here at 40 centimeters, we're starting to get into the size of trees that pine martens will use for their maternal dens. When we get up to 50 centimeters, that's where we start to get fisher use of cavities in trees. So I took those different thresholds and I generalized them into 7 categories of interest from the 20 to the 50 centimeter range. I'm not particularly concerned about the 15 centimeter threshold because whatever we do for the other woodpecker species, we're going to benefit downy woodpeckers. So I wanted to see how long it took to grow aspen to get to the 20 centimeter threshold, the 25, 30, 35 centimeter thresholds on down, so that we can think about managing our forests to benefit these different species. And it's a simple question. And you would think, hasn't this been studied before? Well, the simple answer is not really. And this became clear to me just a year ago when Michael Carson, a University of Minnesota graduate student, defended his thesis. And he was looking at the history of aspen management in the literature. And he looked at this one publication that came out in 1977 by Don Perala. It's called the Manager's Handbook for Aspen Management in the North Central States. And that's the Bible still to this day on how we manage aspen. But Michael Carson looked at, well, where did the data in there come from for the growth rates and things like that? And he tried to track it back, and sometimes he ran into dead ends where, for example, some of the data came from the 1950s, but when he got to that point in time, he couldn't figure out where that data came from, so it was a dead end. And what he was able to track back in time all came from the 1920s. And this was a period in time when aspen was considered a waste species. It was not something we were interested in. Our forest managers then wanted to convert it into pine plantations. But here we are today. Today, aspen is a very important commercial product. We typically manage it at a rotation of around 40 years. And yet we don't necessarily know how long it takes to grow aspen to different sizes. And so we headed off into the woods to core some trees and answer this question. And we did our research all up on the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area or on the federal lands that are managed out of the Red Lake WMA. And all of our work was done in the Agassiz Lowlands ecological subsection right here. So our original objective was to collect 15 aspen core samples around each of those 7 thresholds that I mentioned from the 20 to 50 centimeter diameter, which would have been needing 105 cores. But we did assemble an advisory panel of state and federal researchers, and they recommended that we approach this from a native plant community standpoint. And there are 2 or 3 primary quaking aspen producing NPCs in the Agassiz Lowlands, the MHN 44 community, and then the FDN 32 and FDN 33 communities, which we had to combine together. And so we took that initial objective and we just multiplied it by 2 to come up with 210 cores to collect. And we did restrict our study to wildlife management lands because this is not a forest production question, it's a wildlife question in our minds. Full disclosure, we're not really the first ones to get at this question. In the early 1970s, Bryce Schlegel looked at growth rates in thin aspen stands that were 10, 20, and 30 years old, and he did this in the Pike Bay area around Cass Lake. But because he was really looking at the younger stands, it really didn't get at our question of how long it takes to get it to the sizes that cavity-dependent wildlife can use. So these are our methods. I'll just quickly go through them. We used a GIS to identify easily accessible stands that were from 25 to 100 years old on state lands that fit into those 2 or 3 NPC categories. We then, using GIS, we located one GPS point within the stand to orient us to the correct stand when we were in the field. And then we used that GPS waypoint to select our first aspen tree. And once we got a core from our first aspen tree, we then looked around and we selected one smaller and one larger aspen within eyesight of that first tree to sample. And that was what we did with the MHN 44 stands. And those are shown in green here are the stands we had to select from. When we got into the FDN 32, 33, when we got into the FDN, excuse me, my phone's going off here. There. When we got into our FDN 32 and 33 stands, there were fewer of them to select from. That's why we had to combine them together to get a sufficient sample size. And it became apparent that some of the larger aspen were more scarce there, so we realized we needed to collect 4 samples instead of 3 per stand. And so we would collect 2 larger trees and 1 smaller tree to sample once we found our first tree. I should give you a quick primer on NPCs, the native plant communities. MH stands for Mesic hardwoods. These would be your typical, think sugar maple basswood or oak or aspen birch communities. FDN stands for fire dependent. These are your conifer dominated stands. The first number here, the 4 or the 2 or the 3, that first number represents the moisture gradient that this NPC falls into. And the gradient goes from 1 to 9, 1 being dry, 9 being continuously wet. The second digit, that 4 or that 2 or that 3, represents where that native plant community falls on a nutrient gradient with 0 to 9, with 0 being basically no nutrients and 9 being extremely nutrient rich. And it's those 2 things, moisture and nutrients, that really define what our native plant communities are. So going back to the methods then, we measured the DBH of each of our sample trees in centimeters. We measured the height using a rangefinder. We looked for visible signs of heart rot or decay. Right here, and woodpeckers do the same thing. They focus on those often for their nest trees or even the nest location. And then we collected and we labeled solid cores. We were not collecting cores from rotting trees because we can't read them. We needed a nice, solid, healthy tree to be able to get a good reading on the core. And this is what we did different that other studies have done, and that is we took our cores into a lab to read them underneath a microscope. The Forest Service researcher on our advisory panel articulated very clearly that the way cores are typically read is they're read in the field, and then the core is disposed of, and the cores that are read in the field often are misread by about 9 to 10 years. So to really get a good core read, you have to take it into a lab. And so we took them in, they were mounted, sanded down to get a flat surface, and then read under a microscope. And we also have permanently housed these cores so anybody can go back and look at them again. The results, again, we wanted to try to get 15 samples in each of these categories here, and we clearly succeeded in our MHN 44 NPC. In the fire dependent, we came pretty close to meeting our goals. We fell a little short a couple places, but in the end, we ended up with 109 MHN 44 samples, 102 FDN samples, and then we looked at them, and these are the results in a scattergram. There was a couple of outliers. We had one extremely slow-growing tree here in the MHN 44 category, and we had one extremely fast-growing tree in the FDN category. So we went back to the lab just to verify that those were read accurately, and indeed they were, so they kind of set the 2 extremes. But we used regression analysis to calculate the line here that represents the scattergram, the distribution of the points around these scattergrams. And what was interesting and totally unexpected was basically the two lines are exactly the same in their equations. We expected to have totally different distributions of our points on the different native plant communities. So for example, 9.6 and 9.74 are the y-intercept that defines the dBH. That's 0.14 millimeters difference between the two, and or not one, it's 0.14 centimeters, and this is on a scale of 70 centimeters, so that's basically 1/350th of that scale. I can't even see the difference to plot that difference there. And then at the other end of the spectrum, if you run that equation out to 100 years, the two native plant communities would have a difference of about 4 millimeters after 100 years of growth. And so basically the lines are identical. So we ended up combining them into one data set. All 211 trees are here. And we now have a scattergram that we can start to look at. So these are the quick results here. The smallest trees we recorded were 18 millimeters or 18 centimeters. We had 20 centimeters. We had 8 of them. Youngest tree was 32 years old. The oldest was 60. The average age was 43.2. And this is where we're still in downy woodpecker range, habitat range, and we're already above what is a typical rotation age. If we look at the 20 to 25 centimeter range of trees, again, we're now still basically in downy woodpecker habitat range, but the average age was 45.8. We get up to 25 to 30 centimeters, now we're in that, we've crossed that threshold where woodpeckers are preferentially selecting these trees in proportion to what they're on the landscape. And the minimum age of those trees in our sample was 33. Here's one of our outliers, 94 years old. But the average age of these trees was 50 years old. Get up to the 30 to 35 centimeter range. This is where the hairy woodpeckers, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, northern flickers are selecting for. And here, the average age of our trees is about 58 years old. If we get up to 40, where we have pine martens, the average age of those trees was about 71 years old. This is also pileated woodpecker habitat here, 40 to 50. When we get up to 50, the minimum age for fishers and also there's a kind of a threshold for wood ducks and barred owls. The average age of the trees there was 80 years old. So you can also, best way to look at this, I think, is to apply it at a landscape scale. This represents the availability of trees on the landscape. It's not what's available within a single stand, although I think private landowners could apply this at the stand scale too if they wanted to. But we have the ability to draw lines where if we have this red box here, we can move this central point around to any point on this grid that we're interested in looking at. And we have the different boxes then represent different things. I'm going to skip over it here quickly because I'm running out of time. But let's just take, for example, here, if we wanted to look at a 40-year-old rotation. If we have a 40-year rotation, and let's say we're interested in providing habitat for pileated woodpeckers, we need to have trees greater than 40 centimeters. We've got nothing available for them. We have a few trees down here that are above the 25 centimeter threshold, so we're providing a little bit of woodpecker habitat, but only about a third of the trees are above that size. So if we go up to 50 centimeters, or a 50-year rotation, now we've got a little bit of pileated woodpecker habitat. We're just starting to get it, but if we had a 50-year rotation, we're going to cut them down right after we get to that point. So, but we do have some habitat for yellow-bellied sapsuckers, northern flickers, and hairy woodpeckers. And then if we go up to 60-year rotation, now we're starting to provide habitat for some of these larger species. And so there's just a lot of different ways you can look at it. You could also look at it from the standpoint of the individual birds. You know, let's say, for example, we wanted to provide habitat for yellow-bellied sapsuckers and hairy woodpeckers. Well, to get that, we really have to have a rotation age that's somewhere around, 45 years or so to just start to get into their habitat, providing habitat for them. And if you wanted to look at pileated woodpeckers, well, you're starting to provide habitat for them somewhere around, 45 years too. But so our next steps in our study is we want to expand the study to look at other native plant communities in central and northeastern Minnesota, maybe look at bigtooth aspen in prime fisher and pine marten habitat. These were not necessarily trees that were being used by wildlife. We just wanted to see what was available on the landscape. Now we're interested in seeing what is actually being used, and so we could go out and start coring trees that are actually used by woodpeckers, fisher, pine marten, and see how old they are. See if they're selecting trees that are, say, above the line. That means they're faster growing. If they're selecting trees below the line, they're slower growing trees. So just what component of the trees out there are they selecting for? We could also do some experimental thinning to see if we can grow the trees faster, and we could look at within stand conditions too at various rotation ages. So those are our next steps.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Do we have some questions?
I'm curious if your research will be implemented by forest management groups.
What we want to do is make it available to entities to use. They could be tribal partners, they could be industrial forest land managers, they could be DNR wildlife managers, they could be county foresters. We're hopeful that it will influence forest management, but that remains to be seen. So we just want people to have knowledge so that they know what the implications are of the decisions they're making on the land, and that includes private landowners too, because there are a lot of private landowners that are very interested more so in the wildlife on their land than in the economic return they can get from some harvest. So maybe they can think about holding that aspen 5 or 10 or 15 years more to benefit wildlife.
Thank you, Mike. That was a great talk. I wish we had those data 30 years ago when we developed our extended rotation guidelines at the DNR, which were some quickly dispatched about 10 years ago, as you know. So we had addressed some of the issues for a woodpecker habitat, but the forest products industry and the Division of Forestry basically nixed that. So really good work, and I'm glad you've done it. I would also like to comment on the previous paper with regard to lowland conifers. The DNR for many years has been trying to complete its old growth program in addressing lowland conifers. Initially, they decided, the teams, including Steve Wilson, who many of you know, to look at landscape areas that hadn't been disturbed, and they came up with some pretty large acreages. Those acreages have been greatly reduced. I don't know where it is now, but one thing that would affect habitat for Connecticut warblers would be if just 25% of the people in this room got involved in looking at and commenting on the DNR's lowland conifer old growth program, which again is focused on, or was initially focused on, landscape issues. So that I think could really affect habitats for the birds we've talked about in the last two sessions. Again, thank you.
Right. I think early on there was about 440,000 acres that were deemed possible potential old growth lowland conifers. And right now the target is about 41,000 that we're looking at designating. So about a tenth of it.
other questions for Mike? With your questions, could you also give us a little about who you are? Just the name is fine.
Hi, I'm Greg Severson, and in your talk, you seem to be assuming that the diameter of the trees was what was really important for wildlife use. Is that an assumption, or is there data to show that, or is it perhaps something else about the age of the trees? For example, that the older they get, the more they're likely to rot and be usable.
Yeah. The diameter of the tree is important at the minimum because you have to look at the size of the bird, and it needs to be able to excavate out a certain cavity within the tree in order for the bird to fit in there. And so obviously pileated need a bigger tree than do the sapsuckers and the flickers. But it's also important to look at the mean size of the tree that they're selecting too, because we don't want to manage for the minimum. We want to manage for the medium for the birds, so we're actually providing them something. But yeah, there's a lot of things to think about, the different tree species. You have to think about tree strength and, its ability to resist winds, because wherever the bird creates that cavity, it's creating a weak point in the tree. No, there's definitely a size range that they're selecting for, so the tree size is important. And, the size that they're selecting for in Aspen is different than maybe what they're selecting if they use oak trees, for example. But sometimes in the literature, they just combine all the different species together, and we don't know what the average size was for an individual species. So that's why I created identified all sorts of different thresholds so that people can look at, the variety that's been identified in the literature and make their own choice.
Thank you, Mike.